Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conversations on AI podcast. Today I'm speaking to Su Cizem, an AI Policy Fellow at the Institute for AI Policy and Strategy. Su and I talk about all things AI governance, covering her experience supporting AI governance efforts at both a European and global level. We also had time to discuss her background as a philosopher and what it might mean to govern a potentially conscious AI system. We hope you enjoy the episode.
Hi, Stella, and hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me on. So I'm Su Cizem. I work as an AI policy analyst, visiting fellow or AI policy fellow at the Institute for AI Policy and Strategy, which is a Washington, D.C. based think tank. And I'm currently doing my placement at the Future Society, which is a global governance think tank or a nonprofit organization. I mostly work on multilateral international AI governance, and most recently it was my work on the AI red lines, global call for AI red lines, that brought me onto this podcast.
Yes, brilliant. Well, I can't wait to get stuck in and talking about all your varied experience. To start, we're going to discuss AI governance within Europe. You've got kind of a Europe and an international focus, but we'll start within Europe, focusing specifically on the general purpose AI Code of Conduct, which I know you were involved in the development of. Just for a bit of background for those listening, the EU have enacted a regulatory framework called the AI Act, which works to regulate AI based off of the degree of risk of a specific use case that use case is thought to present. The Act has been praised for its comprehensive approach to regulation and for the boldness of Europe for taking the first step, but some have criticised it for being too onerous for companies to adhere to. So Su, can you talk us through what the general purpose AI Code of Practice is and why it's relevant and how it links in with the AI Act?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the EU was one of the first movers to regulate AI, and they really took a risk-based approach. So they thought, what in our jurisdictions do we absolutely not want to see, and kind of move backwards from there. I think that whole process of coming up with this legislation was a super impressive one, but a lot of people were looking at Europe as, okay, wow, this is quite brave to do that so early on. We don't really know how things will play out, but it's a human rights-based approach. So I think Europe has so far been quite consistent. The Code of Practice is actually a tool that AI companies or those that want to operate high-risk systems within the EU jurisdictions will have to adhere by, and it's a tool that they can use to make adhering by the EU AI Act much easier. Basically, the Code of Practice that I was involved with was a really massive multi-stakeholder collaboration. There were chairs and vice chairs who were in charge of drafting, I think it was 3 versions of the Code of Practice, where civil society, industry, and other stakeholders could give input on. I was part of this civil society group. At the time I was working for the French Center for AI Safety, and we were involved with all 3 parts of the drafts. So we would release, the vice chairs and the chairs would release the Code of Practice drafts online, and then we would give them input as to what we thought specific measures could be improved on. And then there were working groups that we were part of. So it really was like a great and collaborative process. There's not that much that applies for the Code of Practice for like every single company in the EU market. It's more like very big companies, like the ones that specifically pose systemic risks, which are like ones with a lot of compute capacity. I think it's around like 6 or 7 that are almost near those thresholds. Maybe 1 or 2 have passed them already.
So we're talking about the Microsoft, the Googles, OpenAI, that field.
Yeah. Like 10 to the 26 degrees flop, I think, is or maybe it's even 24 degrees, I don't remember. But it's like a very large compute capacity that will qualify to have systemic risks. And they would have to adhere by Article 55, which is what the Code of Practice is based off of. All of that to say, it's like this kind of like a small toolkit to check off as to say, okay, I've done this and I've done that, and now my product is safe to go on the EU market. There's some things on there that I would have liked to see improved, like the kinds of things that companies would have to disclose to the AI office about their models before deployment, or like some rules around transparency that we were kind of advocating for that could have been better. But aside from that, it's, I think, a really great piece of legislation to be, it's like first version out in the world. And it will be developed over time.
So it helps kind of translate different requirements of the Act for companies, for specifically companies that develop and deploy general purpose models, so those big companies that have more of a systemic risk. Why do you think something like a code of practice is required for effective AI governance?
Yeah, the code of practice, I mean, it's not a new concept. It has existed in like other critical domains. There's a code of practice for healthcare systems, a code of practice for like pharmaceuticals. And so like a code of practice just makes like people's lives easier in companies. And I think the code of practice for AI governance also means that you can refer to a piece of document and adopt it elsewhere as well. It does not necessarily have to be in accordance with the AI Act to be a good tool to have. And like most companies that will operate in the EU market maybe will need to be like somewhat familiar with the EU AI Act, but the code of practice is like a very condensed, small version of it. It's just, like 3 different chapters, and you can kind of go to the specific measures that apply to you. So I think it just makes compliance much easier. And as I said, it is like a multi-stakeholder process that resulted in it. So you can just trust that it's coming from people that also know what they're talking about.
So important, multi-stakeholder approaches. I think that's an ethos we really try to bring into the event series, of just how critical it is when we talk about AI to have that varied perspective as part of the conversation. And it's great to hear that was such a forefront of the code of practice. Reflecting on your time there, I guess, do you think there were any perspectives that were missing?
Yeah, I mean, it was a first pass at trying to put together multi-stakeholder approach. I'm not sure how much of that process will be translated into it. I'll speak like personally what it was to be like working in this process as a member of civil society. Like we had very little windows of opportunity to give feedback. So the code would be published, and then we would have, I think, around like a couple of weeks just to be able to like go through it and like give feedback. And most of the time, I think that was enough. It's just, it was like quite burdensome, and it was my full-time focus for those like 3 weeks doing that, and along with other people working in civil society. You also need to consider that there's like a whole industry counterpart to this process where industry is also giving feedback. Something that I think made the process a little bit more difficult was like in the very, very last version, we weren't able to see kind of like a version 3.5 or like the part before the release. And I did get the impression that a lot of like the things that we thought were going to be there, that were there in like the first 2 drafts were removed towards the end. And it was just kind of confusing what was going on. So we did have at some point like a coalition of civil society organizations who came together and were like, okay, we're going to put out a public letter asking for more transparency. We're going to send private letters to the AI office demanding some measures that we're afraid have been pulled out or are missing. So this really was like, at some points like a whole group effort. Sometimes it was more just like, this is the information that we have at the moment. It is hard to pull off this process. So I think in future iterations, and I know the AI office is considering these questions as well, like what worked, what didn't, how is more efficient, because I think it in the end was a lot of input for just a group of voluntary drafters. But lots of lessons learned there, and I know people are thinking about it. I don't know if you do like links to things in the podcast, but I can send you a couple of things from my colleagues in other civil society organizations who have like done work around this and published our critiques of.
Absolutely, yeah, no, I think the more information we can offer people, the better, especially when it's people that were actually involved in that process that are reflecting on kind of lessons learned. Do you feel that the state that the code is in now is functional for effective governance, or do you think there's too much missing maybe?
I mean, the main thing I would point to are like so I think it's a good piece of work, and it's a good piece of legislation, and I'm very happy with the way that it's kind of raised the standard of global AI governance, because I think the Brussels effect definitely is real. Like you do see there's parts of the code of practice that are in glimpses of like some US legislation. Like it's I'm actually quite surprised every time I go like to conferences and abroad outside of Europe, what people actually do know about the code of practice and they have actually read it. So I think it does do what it needs to do, especially the safety and security chapter, I think is like one of the best pieces of legislation we have on global AI governance as an example. What I would like to see more of when you think about advanced AI risks, especially those that can have like systemic risks, only a very few number of actors have access to that information, and those are AI companies themselves. When a model is put onto the market, it is just how the EU is able to, because they're regulating their market. There's like a window, I think up to like 8 weeks for the AI companies to notify the like AI office with a package of information about the product that they're thinking about releasing, and that has like to do with some like pre-deployment notifications. That I think is not like a good enough standard for the world. Like it's not really 8 weeks after a product is put on the market that you have like a safety window. It's more like maybe 8 weeks before, or you have like a little bit like actually like pre-deployment notifications. It's just outside of the jurisdiction of the AI Act at the moment. This is kind of like my personal and like a couple other civil society takes. Again, I can send you a little bit more of like opinionated pieces on this. I would like to see like future versions of the code improved in that regard, or generally like for global governance to adopt like, okay, maybe it's not the AI Act that needs to regulate this, but like how will governments and countries and companies notify each other when things are going to go wrong or can go wrong or have gone wrong internally, but not like on the market. I think that's kind of an important thing to have for global AI governance. And it seemed like in past versions of the code that would happen, but it ended up not being so.
We're talking quite a lot about what could go wrong and systemic risks. And I think maybe for individuals listening, it would be good if you could talk a bit about some examples of what we actually mean by systemic AI risk.
The types of risks are risk to public health, risk to safety, to public security, fundamental rights, and risk to society as a whole. So these are quite general categories. And there's like different points in the AI Act and other EU jurisdictions laws that you can point to like give examples, but big things around like risks that cause major accidents, risks to critical infrastructure, public mental health, freedom of expression and information, non-discrimination, privacy and protection of personal data, environment, non-human welfare, economic security, democratic processes, risks from concentration of power, illegal, violent, hateful, radicalizing, or false content, including risks from Cizem, which is like child sexual abuse material, non-consensual intimate images. So like they're not things that are very outside of like general human rights laws. It's just that there are sorts of like AI use cases or capabilities that enhance these risks, and specific models that's at least how the code has defined it now, which is like specific models above a certain threshold are even more held to scrutiny for these kinds of risks.
I mean, you just reading that list, it really serves to demonstrate how broad the implications of AI actually are and how much governance is attempting to try and prevent and capture. I mean, it sounds like a brilliant experience, your involvement there. And I guess zooming out then into more global perspectives on AI governance. I know you're an advocate for global alignment on AI red lines. Do you want to touch on what an AI red line actually is and why international attention is needed on them?
Yeah, I'll zoom out even a little bit more. Like I think maybe we started off with the code of practice, and I think that was a really good idea. But the code of practice at the time I started working in AI and AI policy was and still is like the main piece of legislation that is like taken into effect on the market. Why this is kind of important for global governance is because, as you've noticed in the last year or two, conversations around safety and what needs to happen regarding safety and what kind of measurements companies and governments need to take to protect civil liberties has changed in regards to AI. This is a developing technology. This is a technology that we don't have, like governments don't have access to or have the capacity to understand. And companies, they have the access and the ability to understand, but not completely what the models do. And plus, they also don't have the same incentives that governments do to protect citizens. So both sides are kind of like partially blind as far as like the stakeholder groups go. And then between different governments, there's also a lot of blind spots. So as this technology occupies parts of the world and has effects, it's very important that we are aligned with the kinds of things that we are looking out for and we're notifying each other of, because recently, like the geopolitical narrative, and this has been the case for a long time, is that around national security, which makes foreign policy quite aggressive, which makes foreign policy quite secretive. And so you, by default, are not sharing a lot of relevant information with adversarial and or aligned countries. So all of that being said, this was like circa, I guess, 2022. I was around the time where I was graduating from Northeastern. I had the opportunity to attend a track 2 where we were discussing different kinds of like biological AI risks. So I was like an AI advisor or a participant in this track 2 dialogue where we would brief government officials about different kinds of AI risks and then have them react given their like country policies. And the thing that was super apparent was that people did take the risks seriously. It's just that the governance mechanisms or the policies, domestic and foreign policies, just didn't allow for them to share the relevant information. And some of the risks that we're concerned with regarding advanced AI have to do with multiple countries. It's never just like one jurisdiction alone that's affected by it. And if you don't have good information sharing mechanisms or protocols to follow in the event of like a global crisis or catastrophe, then there are just a lot of risks inherent in that. So I had turned my attention more towards, okay, maybe it's going to be a hard argument to make, but it seems to be a necessary one, because as the technology gets more and more powerful and it develops in more and more irreversible directions, global governance is left behind. We are still talking about like pre-COVID times standard of information sharing between countries. So yeah, I just saw those two capabilities advancing rapidly. Mm-hmm. And what happens if one jurisdiction takes a risk-based approach and another one takes more of like a move fast and break things and pro-innovation approach, is that like the companies that want to engage in certain or bad actors can pick their jurisdictions, and then there's like a fragmented world where you have kind of a boiling frog problem. Like people just keep doing what they're doing and nothing really makes a coherent picture.
Would you say that's kind of the picture at the minute?
That's a picture at the minute, and I think at times I'm more hopeful and at times I'm less about the direction we're going in. I think there's definitely a lot of progress and very like I don't know, like sometimes a lot of progress happens in one domain where I wasn't expecting it, and like very little happens where I find like more easier areas of opportunity. But yeah, I don't think currently, and I think this was true before AI, but like we don't have a very stable global order. It's very hard to get people on the same page about the future potential capabilities, dangerous capabilities of a technology that may or may not exist when we have like actual problems in the world that currently people can't even wrap their heads around solving. So it's a very hard battle and a very hard field to be in. But that being said, capabilities advance as we're speaking. So it is, in the end, I think very worthwhile to try to get a coherent global picture of governance.
Absolutely. So would you say then the work at the minute is focused on diverting attention to the fact that we need AI red lines, or has work started in defining what the red lines are?
That's a really great question, Stella. Unfortunately, it's more the former at the minute. I think there is definitely a lot of great work being done on specific risk domains. The way that we get, like the main call for the campaign that I was part of, and almost all of our diplomatic engagements are around the fact that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are existing mechanisms that we can use, but they need updating. And this framework, this like I call it like an epistemological shift around red lines, is just calling it something else. It's just calling it like, now we're faced with this new thing. It's very hard for us to agree on a future where we're both happy, but there are futures where we're both unhappy. And this is, I think, where like the red lines is a really nice framework to live by, because it's bringing to the table adversaries who otherwise won't agree on anything to agree on something in common, which we call like the least common denominator, which is like, okay, what do you absolutely not want to see in the world? And can we take responsibilities that we're going to look out for those things in our jurisdictions? And how will we notify each other when we find them? So that's kind of how we're framing it. Unfortunately, right now, it's a lot of like convincing people that this is the right framework and trying to identify really what the bottlenecks are for people to not consider this as a possibility.
What are some of those bottlenecks or challenges, I guess, you're facing?
I think people point to very similar things. Like, as I've said, like we live in a difficult geopolitical reality right now where even if you do have international treaties, enforcement seems to be a bottleneck. So like, who will be in charge of following through? How will we make sure that our adversaries or like other governments that have agreed to things are actually carrying out the activities that they've said? Verification also comes into the picture there. So like, we signed these treaties, we've made these agreements, we've made all of these declarations, like who's checking whether those are becoming actually a thing in the world? I would also point to kind of just a lack of, I think, information in the world about like the actual nature of the risks. I think still we have a lot of people in government or other places of power where they're not entirely bought into AI risks per se, and they don't really like there's really two camps of people who still see AI as just like another tool, not that much better than what we had previously, but maybe one day will be. And another camp of people who see it as like a whole paradigm shift and how humans engage with technology in the world. And people are very scattered across governments. So oftentimes when we bring people together to discuss risk, they're really talking about very different kinds of risks. I do have a lot of solutions to all of those bottlenecks, and I think like a big chunk of our work is trying to figure out like who those people are that we need to bring together to be able to have productive conversations so we're not talking over each other, which counterparts of government need to absolutely communicate and which counterparts like just don't need to be involved at all. How much information are people obligated to disclose with each other? How much of it is just too sensitive? And like a big one is like, what's the role of AI companies and what's the relationship that they need to have with their governments to be able to, at least like in the jurisdiction, have some kind of faith? Because currently everything is voluntary except AI Act.
Do you think that the kind of explosion in the public discourse around AI that's kind of come about post-release of ChatGPT is helping or hindering global alignment?
I think it's definitely helping. Like I remember I was starting to think about these things pre-ChatGPT, and still they felt quite theoretical. Like I was like, okay, surely like this, if that were true, could be a big problem, or like, well, maybe one day it will be, maybe in my lifetime. And then it went to like the next month where I was like, never mind, I totally see how we're like, at least the public is not very much at the frontier. We're not at the cutting edge of technology. We just kind of get whatever is released publicly. So I think the public, as they get more and more engaged with AI models, as they follow closely this like rhetoric between AI companies and the leaders of these AI companies, I think they get more involved. And I am a civil society member, and I'm a big believer that public information is like an obligation that AI companies and governments have, because like we don't really get a say most of the time in how this technology develops, but these are permanent developments. It's very hard to pull things back once they're out in the world. So I think it helps. How much of the rhetoric is healthy and sustainable, it's to be seen. But I would still put my bet that like the general public are quite conflicted and don't have enough information to make sound judgments about AI model uses.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think when you compare that to the rate at which it's being kind of pushed on people, you're not giving people a moment to kind of catch up and educate themselves. On the topic of information then, I guess, going away from the public discourse and more towards discourse within governments. So when you are engaging with governments around trying to garner support for the requirement for global red lines, how much does technical know-how come into it? Like, how much do people need to understand how a system works before they can kind of pass judgment on managing red lines?
Yeah, it's so far been a mix. I think, so we split up like the red lines work stream at least into two parts, one on AI capabilities and one on use cases. I think the one on use cases, so maybe some like missing piece of the puzzle for our conversation are AI incidents. There are things that happen in the world that get picked up by the media or that get thrown some policymakers' way, either because somebody in their jurisdiction or an adjacent jurisdiction has been affected by an AI model misuse or misbehavior or some kind of use case that affects real people, and then now policymakers have to start thinking about it. Oftentimes policymakers have their own specific interests, like some are specifically interested in doing something good in their jurisdiction around children or education, and then AI is thrown their way and they have to kind of grapple with it. Or things like cyber use cases or critical infrastructure, like governments are constantly having to grapple with this. They don't have the technical know-how by default. It's like a very small group of politicians I've actually engaged with who have the technical background. Now, does that need to be necessary for them to engage in red lines? I think not by default, but I would urge all governments and like diplomats who are engaging in discourse around AI to have like a group of people that they trust where they get their information from, and that those people aren't just directly representatives of industry. Because there are like researchers or an ecosystem of AI safety researchers who like genuinely do great work and do try to communicate risks as they come up. And I think those kinds of like AI capability risks, you do need to have at least like a curiosity, not the knowledge, but like the curiosity that like, are these systems behaving in the ways that AI companies or those at the forefront running this technology say they're behaving, or do we just not know enough? Do we just like, where is this going? So yeah, it is the case that those who have previously grappled with like some kind of model, who have exposure to like some kind of technical understanding, do get on board a little bit earlier, at least on like the capabilities front. But I think everybody's starting to wake up to the dangers of AI, or at least like unaligned, uncontrolled AI, because we're having specific incidents starting to pop up around the world.
Have you, I mean, I'm sure you absolutely have, but there's the AI incident database, which I believe is still being updated, but it's a website where people can go and live and see incidents that are occurring. I think it's so helpful to kind of contextualize and bring to life what we mean by an AI harm, or a risk. Okay, so from a global red line perspective, it sounds like a lot of the focus at the minute is trying to bring attention to the fact that it's a requirement. So I guess going forward, maybe if we frame it within the next year, what's something that you would like or you would recommend to see happen?
I say this as like someone who's a lover of like diplomacy and nation states, and I still have like glimpses of hope around global governance. And I don't know, I just think we've like managed to do something quite beautiful with different human societies over time, and I think there's something there worth preserving. So I appeal to global governance, I appeal to different governments with hope that in the next year they'll be able to do what they have done best in human history, which is come to touch points with their agendas to look out for the well-being of the public that they represent. So in the next year, there will be multiple opportunities for governments to come together, either officially via multilateral channels or like on the side at different kind of events or in bilateral meetings and phone calls where they will discuss something related to AI. I urge the people that I talk to in my team and in our broader coalition of groups of people who are working on this, to just start asking people, what are the red lines in your jurisdiction that are non-negotiable? Like, what would a red line look for the UK? What would a red line look for the US and China? And is there a common picture here that we can paint? And if so, is there a way which we can elevate this discourse to the next touch point? So I also had started working with the French Center for AI Safety around the AI Action Summit. This happened, and then we started working on the code of practice kind of simultaneously. And the AI Action Summit, as you know, is a manifestation of this Bletchley process that started in the UK. This really was a global conversation around AI safety that has taken a different shape now, but maybe pendulum also swings back at some point. Like the India Impact Summit coming up in February, like this new global dialogue on AI at this UN level. There are other also opportunities coming up in the next year where governments, adversaries, friends, foes will come together to discuss AI. And my hope is that at least in those meetings, we have a clear picture of the kind of assurance that we're not going in a direction that hurts everybody involved, that we're not stuck in this prisoner's dilemma, AI race to the bottom, that we are actually being very careful about the kinds of futures we're bringing onto the world, and we're not being very careless, and that governments actually in the next year can give public assurance about those kinds of dialogues. Because I think the default now is that people are oh, well, someone surely is taking care of it somewhere, but the truth is they're not unless they make any public declaration on it. So I'm hoping that something like that comes out of the next year, 2026.
Absolutely. So get involved and listen with an open mind in a proactive manner, I think, is important, because you're right. We have some amazing examples of historically coming together, but it tends to be reactionary.
Yeah, and I think I often, and I understand that people are quite frustrated with governments. Governments are quite frustrated with people. There's a whole cycle of frustration out in the world, and we do tend to point to things that have not worked in the past for reasons that they won't work in the future. I think governments or AI companies, people actually have the power to look at the world and say, okay, this didn't work before because we needed this and we currently don't have this in the world. Then I would urge people to ask, what would it take to make that happen? So if it is a lack of information sharing protocols, then let's develop them. If it's a lack of verification mechanisms, let's invest and develop them. There are actual solutions to these problems. It's just that you have to call them problems that are solvable.
Mm. Do you think there's because we've been speaking about, governments getting together and governments having conversations. Do you think there's a space for kind of public demanding that governments do this?
Yeah, this is something I'm personally very interested in. I think we've recently, I would point to some research from the Pew Research Center, I'll send that your way, where we're trying to do, civil society and research centers are trying to do these public consultations to try to have an understanding of what the public actually want. Mm-hmm. Because I think most of the time the public are given products and then they either are forced to adopt them or adopt them in a certain direction that works, and then there's just more products that come out in that direction. This is a history of capitalism that maybe does not hold anymore, given the just concentration of, well, there's only just a few companies that have the resources that can put out products in that domain. And then do people actually want this kind of stuff? Do people actually understand what they're using? What would a red line look like for the public? Is it very different than what it would look like for? So I think there's some research that's beginning to come out in this domain. I definitely think there's more room to understand where there could be more improvement. My research, I don't know, we have 9 minutes now, but the one on the public understanding of AI sentience and moral rights, there was at the time, this is one of the only pieces of research, not mine specifically, but the data set that I used was one of the only pieces of research where people were actually asking the public, or in this case, the American public, how are you using AI? What do you think about AI? Do we understand what the public are thinking about this?
So this was your research that you did as part of your thesis when you were doing your master's at NU London?
Yes. And this is like a data set of 1,500 respondents. There's this other organization called the Collective Intelligence Projects that do some kind of public polling. I would point to their work, the Pew Research Center, but absolutely like big area of opportunity here is to just get more data from the public and try to understand how it is that they're using these AI models and want to keep using them in the future, and what do they not want in the world. Like, I think every single person using it would say something along the lines of like, I don't want to lose my job to AI. Like, does the government have an obligation then to act on that?
So what was your thesis about in more detail then? I guess what was the public perception on AI sentience and moral rights?
Yeah, I mean, at the time that wasn't very, I think it was around like 36% that said that they were sentient. So, okay, just a little bit of context. Like, before I started working in AI policy and AI governance, I was a philosophy student. I was studying the philosophy of mind. I was very interested in different theories of consciousness. And my advisor at the time was a big skeptic, and I think still is, on AI consciousness or any kind of synthetic consciousness. And in U London, I don't know, I think David is part of your community. He was kind of this person who was like a philosophy and computer science overlap. But we had a couple different advisors, and one of mine was a computer science advisor, and one of them was David, who was the philosophy counterpart. And I had a really big personal interest in just like thinking about AI consciousness. But NU London at the time was, and I don't know what their stance is now, but they were like, I don't know if this is like a super interesting area that most people like actually can operationalize. Like, is this really something that is worth, like, this just sounds like a big philosophy question. But then I found this incredible study where they have publicly released their data sets of public's opinion about AI sentience and moral rights pre-ChatGPT. And then they had done the same study the year after it was launched. And the idea that this would be like a longitudinal study, so that they would do this every year, and over time we'd have kind of a shifting perspective of AI sentience. It's actually reminding me I should go back and check if there's a newer version of it. But so at the time, there was this like combined data set of these 2 years where the data set had so much information. It had information about people's demographics, their backgrounds, whether they had interacted with an AI before, how they interact with AI, what models they use, what do they think about the sentience of other beings. So then I was trying to make some like clusters of profiles of people and answer the question like, what kind of person would believe that AI is sentient? What kind of person would think that it has any moral rights? Does it have to do with some distinct demographic features? Because if so, then you can make a policy around the kinds of people you represent. Because if like a majority of your public is, I don't know, if like education has something to do with it, the majority of your public is uneducated about AI capabilities and like what AI actually is, and the majority of your public are using AI, then probably you can make the conclusion that they maybe will believe that it's sentient and you'll have to protect it somehow. So I just wanted to understand, like, could you make any policy conclusions based off of people's demographic features? And there were some correlations between different demographic information. Of course, I also hesitate to like make such like strong declarations about what those demographic features are, because this is still 1,500 people. It's not that many people, and there could be a lot of problems with the data set that I don't know about. But it seemed like, yes, there are some demographic features, and one big indicator is like whether people have interacted with AI. So if someone of a certain background had an opinion about AI sentience and moral rights, that opinion shifts the next year because they have interacted with AI, and that's like the main difference there.
What,
and I think that's
shifts in what direction? Pro sentience or against?
I mean, there was an increase in pro sentience after people have interacted with them.
Was it specifically ChatGPT they were interacting with?
Not specifically ChatGPT. It's more like the LLM profile of AI models. So I think things that like appear conscious, that say they're conscious, that I don't know, give you the feeling that they're conscious, are more likely to be treated as such. And I think this is something that people are starting to pay a little bit more attention to recently because of certain incidents with like children using AI models or becoming very addicted to them, or people using it as like this loneliness sort of cure because they have these companions now. And I think I do hold out suspicion that this kind of research will be, at the time it wasn't so in demand, but I think will be over time more in demand because of these cases.
No, absolutely. And that kind of takes me directly onto the question of, going down the train of thought, okay, people do believe AI is conscious or sentient or exhibits human-like emotional capabilities in some regards, and then develops emotional attachments to AI, which, as you've mentioned, is actually been happening. At what point does AI governance come into it, and how do we kind of manage the risks posed by that?
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the red lines that I think people should consider. Like, I'm very careful to not impose any, because I really do appeal to like global governance to kind of look out for the public. But like, if there was like one I could light the light bulb for people, just because I've like personally looked into it, is that like, I think as we have this debate about consciousness, which hasn't been solved, like anybody who's like studied this in philosophy will have known the frustration of like, okay, where are we then? Like, what's the ultimate theory here? And there really isn't one that people point to. I think we get closer and further away from it, depending on who you talk to. But while humans grapple with this like big idea of consciousness, you have a big chunk of your population who are more and more interacting with things that appear conscious. And in the end, where I fall is that and it's not even me, like in my research, I cite this one paper, like 2 weeks before I published, or I submitted my thesis, this like missing piece of my research puzzle was published, which is, okay, what are the 4 possible futures of AI sentience? And is there a way to like morally rank which one's better or worse? So like, is the future where AI is conscious, but we don't treat it as such? So we treat conscious things like they're not conscious, and maybe we cause them suffering. Is that a worse world than the one where they're not conscious, but we treat them like they are? Like, what's the trade-off there? And I think that research kind of ranks them, and the worst one does come out to be the one where you have this like multitude of digital beings that are conscious, and you just don't give them any rights or protect them in any way. And I think that's kind of hard for policymakers to grapple with, and it'd be very hard to give policymakers like, oh, like in any case, you should be careful about AI wellness and welfare. This is a hard argument to make. What the one I make is like, you can go to a lot of these like Reddit support groups for people who have had like replica AI girlfriends, but that have like lost specific features, and now it feels like their girlfriend is lost forever. And so there is like a big chunk of people's populations who will start treating AI models or companions as, even if they're not conscious, as things that deserve protecting and have some kind of moral rights in virtue of like humans having them and caring about them. It's a very complicated field, but like, I think at some point, and not some point too late in the future, we will start to see policy catch up with the demand for this kind of thing.
No, I hope so. I mean, it's almost futile in a way, arguing around what is conscious if actually it's having the impacts of a conscious being.
I mean, I also would, like, Anthropic, for example, is one of the companies actually has like dedicated research on this, because this is like something philosophers or people who are like, what's the value in bringing in this like very complicated discussion into something that's kind of quite technical and like maybe is not so immediately satisfying? The value is that, like, I don't know, there's this idea of like cause X, which I really like to think about. I forget who the idea came from, but like, what are the things that we're doing now that people in the past would have, or like, what are the things that people in the past have done that we think right now with our like moral superiority think, oh my gosh, that was such an atrocious moral crime? And is there something we're doing right now that future generations will say, oh my gosh, how could they not have thought about this? And like, how could they not have like dealt with this? I think that's like a good position to be in morally, just so you're like kind of conscious about like your own habits. But then also like, if you're somebody who is speaking on behalf of a people, so like if you're a governor, if you have like some kind of position of power, if you're in charge of releasing new AI model capabilities, that you are also looking under this rock and saying, okay, is there some work that I can bring in here from people who have like domain specific expertise that could address like at least the framework of the problem? And I think AI consciousness just happens to be one of those.
Do you think current companies, not governments, but companies, are doing enough in this regard?
I don't think they're doing enough. I think they're starting to work on this more. Like I said, I point to Anthropic. I think also DeepMind has like some work. I think they also look a lot at human-computer interactions. I think we will need to look at how people are using AIs and what the emotional relationship there, psychological relationship there are. And then also philosophically, like we need, I think, new philosophies around this emerging technology. I think there are like a lot of outdated arguments that we just need to kind of update with new information. And I don't know whether that's like the work of AI companies or like just these like niche researchers or thinkers that will just need to come about in the world. But AI companies have privileged access to user information and these like human-computer interactions. So I think there ought to be more work on this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much, Su. This has been a brilliant conversation. You've done some incredible work across AI governance and also thinking about some thorny philosophical issues around AI sentience and moral rights.
Thank you so much.